And today I'm going to tell you a story of mystic magic and how I got Fred. Ah, sort of an interesting word, Fred. Well, first of all, whenever I talk about Fred, is I put on hats, an old leather cowboy hat. That's another story. Then I bring you on a wonderful journey. And it starts right here, Fremont, California. And I received a magical gift. It was a wonderful gift. Now, how did I get it? Where did it come from? What was it? Well, I had a studio where I created art and sold it. And this fella came in and he said, "My name's Frank Newman." He says, "I've got some sculptures that I'd like you to sell." And I looked at him. He looked like he just came off building a roof. And he says, "I just came off building a roof." Oh, what? That tells me why he looks like that. He says, "I'm a contractor, and a fella hasn't paid me." He says, "I have some art I'd like you to sell." And I said, "Well, that sounds really nice." I looked and I says, "What is he going to show me shingles?" He says, "No." He says, "I'm a miner up in the Sierras, and I find stones, big stones, that I absolutely love." He says, "and I carve things out of them with big chisel and then polish." I looked and I said, "Oh, what am I going to go look at?" He says, I have a couple of them in my truck, my pickup. Want to see?" I says, "Sure." And I sort of walked behind him expecting nothing. Well, I pulled back the canvas on his pickup, and there was a white buffalo in alabaster. It was spectacular. And I do Indian tribes. And Indian tribes of the plains consider every white buffalo sacred. And I looked and I said, I got something very, very special happening here. And I said, I love it. And then he showed me two dolphins he did in a beautiful marble that he dug out of the ground up in the Sierras. And I said, oh, this is so beautiful. Well, I went out the next day and I bought special places to show these master works. They were beautiful. Absolutely beautiful. And Frank came in and saw the way I displayed them and the marketing I'd done to sell them. And he said to me, "Roland, what can I do for you?" I looked at him and in my office there are about 10 or 15 wizards and sorcerers because I love them, because they're fun. I said, "Frank, up in the Sierras, what I want you to do is I want you to find me a magic staff." Frank sort of looked at me funny and said, "Okay, Roland, you're on." So I didn't hear from Frank, and I thought it just went through and it was just a nice thing to talk about and have fun with. 2 weeks later, Frank came in and he had this long thing sitting in an Indian blanket. It was weird, an Indian blanket. I says, what's that, Frank? He says, that's your magic staff, Roland. I said, where'd you get it? He says, up at Paradise. I says, Paradise? So you got me a magic staff out of Paradise? Yes, my mind is in Paradise, California. Well, man, that was really funny. Paradise magic staff? Okay, Frank, thanks. So I said, here, let me show you. And I opened it up, and I lifted it out. And that staff was beautiful. Now, I have it right in front of me. And if you go on Old Man Stories, you'll see the staff. Well, later on he called himself Fred, but at that time he was just Staff. And Staff is beautiful. It was made out of one piece of manzanita. And it was gorgeous reds and browns. And it had a weird shape on the head. I just, wow. That's really a weird shape. And I looked at it and I looked it over. And he said, Roland, it came out of the ground this way. He said, I cut the mouth and I put emeralds in the eyes. See those emeralds, Roland? Those are real emeralds. And I said, oh. And it, you know, it's got maroons in it. And it's beautiful. And he says, you know how I found this? I says, how, Frank? He says, I was on my magic dragon, which I call a caterpillar. He meant his dirt pusher caterpillar. But that was phenomenal. He said, and I was right on the side of a hill and I was pushing the soil up, looking for gold. He says, and up, even with the top of the cat. That's short word for caterpillar. For us caterpillar guys. Or Tonka toy guys. It depends on what you want to call them. So, he says, I saw up there on the hill. He says, I saw your staff. And it was under brambles. It was all, and I saw it, and it just stood there, and it says, he said, that's Roland's staff. I said, wow. He says, and I had to crawl over the top of the caterpillar and then climb on the hill. And he says he had to walk over. He says, showed me several scratches he had on his arms, one on his neck. He says, I crawled through brambles to get it. And he says, I got to it, and it just broke off like it was ready to come home with me. Well, I brought it home. I just sanded it, did what I said, and I brought it to you. And here's your magic staff. And I looked, and I looked, and it looked like what and I says, oh, is this a dragon? He says, nope, Roland, that's not a dragon. I says, what is it, Frank? He says, that's a snake. I said, when I first saw it, I thought it looked like a snake, but I said, thank you, Frank. And then I thought, he's giving me a snake. What does that say? Ah. Well, here comes more mystic magic. That day, a lady came in to visit me. And this lady was a mystic, or she called herself a mystic. And she told me all about the things that she'd done. And I showed her the staff, and she says, just a second, I got something that I want you to listen to about snakes. So I said, fine. She gave me a whole, like 5 VHSs. I know no one knows what they are anymore, but us old fellas do. They're like DVDs. And I went home, and that night I marathon watching them, and I started about 8 in the evening and I finished at 5:30 in the morning. The last tape before I finished was about snakes. And it was written by a phenomenally famous person that had studied all the religions of the world. And he said, snakes have been given a bad reputation. He says, in all the religions, except the biblical ones, he says, snakes are a rebirth. They mean being born again. He says, even in the Bible, Moses had 2 staffs that had snakes. And they did wonderful magic things. And all of a sudden, my staff started changing in my eyes. This was really something cool. And I sort of touched it. And it felt so good. And his emerald eyes just looked out at me. And it still hadn't named itself. Well, a week later, I went up to the mine in paradise. So I went to paradise to find something else that was mystic magic. And Frank invited me to go gold prospecting. Well, I told Frank I'd love to gold prospect as long as I don't have to take one of those pans and run water through it. He says, Roland, you can drive the cat. Oh! I was in 7th heaven. I could get in that big cat and I could work the gears and I could move soil. And he'd say, okay, see this plot of soil over here? You move it over there. And I'd do it and I'd work, and it took me, about 45 minutes to do. He says, I got to move it back again now. And he went and did it in about 3.5 minutes. But I got to do stuff with a cat, and that was magic for me. That's absolutely kid magic. That's my Tonka toy stuff. But that wasn't the magic. That night, Frank says, I have the most beautiful, fantastic Chinese restaurant you'll ever see. It's better than anything in San Francisco. And I said, I lived in San Francisco, and that's pretty doggone hard to beat. So he brought us, and this Chinese place in paradise was beautiful. We went in, and we sat down, and the first thing this lady did is come out, put a beautiful tablecloth out there. And I looked, and it had all these characters going around the edge. I says, what are those characters? He says, those are birth signs. Oh! And it had the year of it. Oh! I looked, and I said, wow, where am I? And I looked down. Guess the year I was born, Jeff.
The year of the snake?
Yes. I was born in the Chinese year of the snake. I walked out, and I turned to Terry, and I says, what should we call our magic staff? She says, well, let's not make it too conceited. Okay, Fred's the name.